Welcome to ODI on this fine morning. My name is Alex Thier. I am the executive director here, and we are very excited to have you for this event today on providing decent jobs for all. This is truly one of the issues of our era, and we have an incredible group of people here to talk to you today. We are first and foremost honored, who I will introduce in a minute, to have Her Excellency Amina Gurib Fakim, who is the President of the Republic of Mauritius, and she is going to open us today with a keynote speech. This speech will be followed by a panel discussion, including Louise Fox, who I just saw up on the screen, my friend Louise, who is currently the chief economist, thanks for waving, the chief economist at USAID, Myrtle Whitboy, who is right here. She is the president of the International Domestic Workers Federation, and Elizabeth Stewart, who is the head of the Growth, Poverty, and Inequality program here at ODI. This will be led by Jonathan Rosenthal, the Africa editor of The Economist, who I will turn over to in a minute following the speech. In addition to our fantastic audience here in London, we also have a lot of people following us around the world. And we will invite you all to participate later in the event as well. If you would like to join the conversation today, we're using the hashtag Global Challenges, and our handle is @ODIDev. But we're going to start with something very special. We are greatly honored to have with us today President Amina Gurib Fakim of the Republic of Mauritius. She is the 6th president of the Republic of Mauritius and its first female president. She also serves as the co-chair of the Global Commission on the Future of Work. And before joining the State House and ultimately rising to the level of president of her country, she also led an incredibly impressive career as an academic and as a scientist. So she brings an incredible array of experience and insight into her role as president and also now as co-chair of this incredibly important commission. So without anything further, I welcome to the podium President Gurib Fakim. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thier, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As the chairperson of the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work, it is indeed my privilege to be here today to address the particular challenges facing girls and women in the low-paid labor market globally. Who are the women at the bottom of the labor market? Well, they work across the world, in rich and emerging economies, in urban and rural areas, for digital platforms in homes, farms, and factories, and in the informal and formal economies. They come from diverse backgrounds, and yet they have major similarities when it comes to their daily lives and working conditions. Indeed, there remain stubbornly persistent gender differences in pay and in the types of jobs that men and women perform. It is time to eliminate these gaps and to do so by empowering women to choose more decent jobs. Take, for example, the personal stories of 4 women that ILO colleagues have met in different parts of the world: Agatha, Lydia, Valiama, and Tanya. Agatha, 33, left Poland to work in Germany as a domestic worker. She works for several homes, caring for the elderly and keeping households clean. Her hours are unpredictable from week to week. She works mostly without contracts and often at rates below the minimum wage. From her meager salary, she supports her family back home in the hope of ensuring a more promising future for her children. Lydia, 43, is an indigenous woman from Bolivia who has been working in the construction sector for 3 years. At the beginning, she was employed through informal contractors and was not paid. So she began working for her own account. Every morning, she gets up early, leaves her daughter at school, and meets with other women builders to offer their services. Valyama from India works for 8 to 10 hours a day, starting at 5 a.m., making for the trimming the global shirts for the global brand. She then takes care of her ailing husband and 2 children. She's one of the 40,000 home workers who are part of the supply chain in the garment manufacturing industry in Tirupur, a busy town in Tamil Nadu. The T-shirts she's making will sell for at least 1,000 times more than what she earns. But home-based work is not solely present in developing countries. In the United States, the ILO met Tanya, a mother of 2. At the age of 42, she had to quit her job to stay home to care for her father. She now works from home as a crowd worker, often earning the minimum wage. These women live and work in vastly different contexts. Yet, they all work for low pay, most of the time less than their male counterparts, and struggle to cope with the double burden of paid and unpaid labor required to care for their families. These challenges transcend nationality, culture, GDP, and workplace. Women, ladies and gentlemen, are overrepresented among the low-paid in both developed and developing countries. In Europe, for example, women make up on average 50 to 60% of workers in the 3 lowest pay deciles. Women also suffer from a significant wage penalty throughout the world, ranging from 5 to 30%. This pay gap is due at least in part to the overrepresentation of women in sectors where their work is undervalued, domestic work and home-based work being 2 key examples. 80% of domestic workers are women, and only half of all domestic workers enjoy a minimum wage protection equal to those enjoyed by other workers. In crowd work, the gender wage gap is highest, 25%, amongst those with the lowest earning. Ladies and gentlemen, women are also more subject to part-time and temporary work. Such jobs are on the rise and have raised concerns about job quality in general, and as they often guarantee only limited or no labor and social protections. Part-time employment, fewer than 35 hours per week, is a widespread phenomenon among women in nearly all countries of the world, and their share of all those working part-time is 57%. Women employees are also often overrepresented in temporary rather than permanent jobs, ranging from over 20% in some European countries to around 70% in India and parts of Africa. Women are often overrepresented in informal employment, and especially in the most vulnerable forms of employment. This is due at least to the lower access to education, training, economic assets, and other resources. At least 60% of all women in employment are in the informal economy, where they are more often found in the most vulnerable situation, for instance, as domestic workers or home-based workers than the male counterparts. The proportion of women contributing family workers, another form of vulnerable work, is more than 3 times higher among women in informal employment, 28.1% compared to men, 8.7%. It is in these types of jobs that decent work deficits are most pervasive. They thus face a double penalty, both as women and as informal workers. Such deficits often imply a violation of human rights. Indeed, it is important to note many labor rights are human rights. For instance, the right to rest, to social security, to equal pay, and freedom of association. Ladies and gentlemen, women are overrepresented in poor quality jobs, in part due to their traditional role as unpaid caregivers. Everywhere in the world, women shoulder more of the care responsibilities. These responsibilities shape their access to labor markets and push them into accepting jobs that are more likely to allow them to conform to their traditional role as caregivers. These tend to be informal, temporary, or with shorter hours due to the flexibility these kind of jobs often afford. For example, women are more likely to enter crowd work because it allows them to perform care duties at the same time. Women at the bottom of the labor market may be particularly vulnerable to violence at work. Women who work in private homes, either in their own as home workers or in what their employers, in the case of domestic workers, work behind closed doors and often out of reach of public authorities. This can make them more vulnerable to violence at the hands of other household members. Women who work in male-dominated sectors, such as in construction, are also particularly vulnerable to violence. Ladies and gentlemen, underpinning these conditions is the widespread discrimination that women face in the labor market and beyond, as women, but also as members of already marginalized communities, such as indigenous people and migrants. Female migrant workers are overrepresented in low-skill occupations, both in comparison with male migrants and with native-born workers. Discrimination pursues women throughout their professional lives, pushing them into jobs that are associated with women's work, such as domestic work, resulting in pronounced segregation into occupations that are undervalued. Layered on top of the particular challenges of women in low-paid work worldwide is the reality of the effects of deep learning and artificial intelligence on the human labor force. Technology is driving a skills gap in which there are fewer and fewer jobs for underskilled or low-skilled workers everywhere in the world. In conditions of equality, the empowerment of women workers, that is the capacity to choose what work they perform and under what conditions they perform it, must be the future of work. Ladies and gentlemen, women workers can lead us there, and we must create an environment that enables and supports their empowerment. How can this be achieved? While efforts will be required on many fronts, I would like to draw the attention to four broad overlapping approaches: gender-responsive formalization policies, ensuring equality of treatment, affordable care policies, and the elimination of violence. Women's economic empowerment must be achieved in conditions of decent work, and gender-sensitive formalization policies are a key avenue to achieving this goal. Formalization is about bringing people under the effective protection of the law and thus guaranteeing them access to rights. At the political and institutional level, we must ensure that women are afforded labor and social protections equal to those enjoyed by workers generally. Such strategies have included the extension of labor and social protection to female-dominated sectors that have historically been excluded, such as domestic work. Extension of social protection can include eliminating or lowering threshold on minimum hours, earning, or duration of employment, so that workers in part-time and temporary employment are not excluded, or making systems more flexible with regards to contributions required to qualify for benefits. Measures of this kind also work to combat discrimination against migrants, indigenous peoples, and other minorities. Ladies and gentlemen, to combat discrimination, which affect all women workers, gender-specific measures can be taken to ensure equal protections that address the undervaluation of women's work. These can include extension of minimum wages to female-dominated sectors, extending duties on employers to promote gender equality, and ensuring equal treatment for part-time and temporary workers. Providing access to affordable care options can also alleviate women from the double burden of paid and unpaid work. Provision of high quality and affordable care facilities women access to formal employment and would lift the constraints that cause women to choose lower quality jobs in exchange for the flexibility of staying at home. The investment of the public and private sector in the innovation economy is also an essential element of raising workforce conditions and increasing economic and human welfare across society. And that's one of the reasons why I serve as chair of the Coalition for African Research and Innovation, known as CARI, and that was recently launched initiative at Davos called the Afro-Champion Initiative. These broad Pan-African organizations have been created by private and public stakeholders in recognition that our health and well-being are at the nexus of not just the interdependent, transdisciplinary nature of scientific research, but a part of a broader context at the intersection of nutrition, health, agriculture, environment governance, and the economy. These investments require sustained operational funding, capital support, and the capacity to engage successfully with funders, government policymakers, and communities. This, in turn, will raise the value of work across society. Creating an environment that enables women to realize their own empowerment also requires shifting discriminatory social norms and ending of violence against women. Because subject to violence in its various form, and even accepting it as a norm, shapes how women choose. When they face domestic violence, it drives them to work in other people's home, often abroad, as domestic workers. When they face violence at work, it drives them to accept substandard working conditions. And the constant exposure to violence and harassment drives women to accept that such violences are normal, eroding their self-esteem and the belief that they have the right to better work and better life. The pervasiveness of this threat, which is based on widespread gender discrimination, has instigated the process to adopt a new ILO standard on violence against women and men in the world of work. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by underscoring that women's empowerment should be synonymous with women being unable to represent their own interests and to express their own preferences. Without this capacity, it would be very difficult to speak meaningfully of empowerment because the fate of women would be determined by others. For this reason, the right of women to have a choice, to be their own representatives, and to gain bargaining power lie at the heart of the opportunity for women to seize their own destinies, not least of all for those women working at the bottom of the labor market. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that very insightful talk. I'm going to come back to some of the topics. I think that you really raised important issues in terms of placing women at the centre of this conversation. So thank you for doing that. I see we've been joined by other panelists. I'm also going to thank Alex. I don't think it's quite necessary for me to go through a very long set of introductions since a lot of that's already been done. But we've got Myrtle at the far end. Oh, I've dropped something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Myrtle at the far end. Louise on the video. Elizabeth right next to me. We're going to try and keep this sort of as informal as possible. So I'm going to ask you to be a bit lively when it comes time to ask some questions. So I'm sure we'll have some lively debate later. But before we get into that, I'm going to first turn to the author of this paper that we've been discussing. And I guess the first thing that strikes me is when one thinks about this, and certainly when one talks to people in developing countries, there really is this view that unless it's a formal job in an office or a factory with everything else, it's not a good job. Is that wrong?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's the attitude that this is the informal sector is some kind of aberration. it's going to go away, it's a sort of stage of development. Well, I mean, we make the point in this paper, and I should start by thanking my co-authors who are in the room, Abigail Hunt, who I think is somewhere over there, and Emma Saman, who's there. We were very clear in this paper that the first best approach for providing decent jobs is formal jobs with, secure contracts, secure, the decent wages, good recognition, decent working conditions. All those things are really important. However, the paper's also a plea to pragmatism. That's not the starting point for the vast majority of workers already in work. So 7 in 10 workers in the non-farm economy at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South and Southeast Asia, are working informally. And I think more importantly, even kind of sort of the scale of the size of the number of people who are going to need to be found jobs, wage employment, is larger than we have initially thought of anyway, which sounds complicated, I'll explain. So according to current ILO definitions, there are 200 million people unemployed. Actually, the number of people who want to work, who are looking for jobs, is around 10 times that. That's globally. So there are around 2 billion people actually who want to work, and 2/3 of whom are women. And the reason they can't find work is because the jobs aren't there. So the scale of the challenge is much bigger than we think. Plus, we know we've got the youth bulge coming down the track, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The number of 15 to 24-year-olds, which is a good proxy for entrance to the labour market, that's going to increase by half again by 2030. So situation is already the majority of people working in the informal economy, that's likely to grow significantly. So the paper is a plea to kind of, policymakers don't let the best be the enemy of the good, or maybe the enemy of the better. If you're not going to, if the formal economy is not going to be able to absorb that number of current entrants, let alone new entrants, anytime soon, how is it that working conditions, that wages, that productivity can be increased in the informal economy? And that's what we're looking at. We've divided, informal workers, it's a very heterogeneous group. So we've divided, we've looked at a range of kind of policies and programs that governments, local governments, in some cases NGOs or other sort of programs or projects that are being delivered to people working in the informal economy. What's working now? And then we're saying to other countries, maybe you might want to look at, instead of thinking that the informal sector is something to be got rid of, maybe there's some models here that you can follow. So looking at self-employed or household enterprises, we point to the example of on the border of India and Pakistan, there's a number of border hats, they're called. They're kind of like, India and Bangladesh. They're kind of like special enterprise zones. They're sort of trade facilitation points where small informal workers are helped with cross-border trade. And they've increased wages. They've been so successful that there's now a commitment to increase them, to introduce 6 more border hats. They've also, interestingly, improved relationships between the informal workers and the authorities. We look at the example of an area in Lima, in Peru, where waste pickers have been given a uniform, so they're kind of identifiably part of a workforce. They've said they feel safer because they have this uniform, but they've also been included in the municipal planning processes. So they're kind of, they're being recognised as actual workers, and their needs and priorities are being included in the planning process. We include an example from Ethiopia, where this is part actually of a randomised controlled trial. But largely unskilled, poor women have been given a cash transfer, but also kind of business support, mentoring, training. And a year later, they found that their salaries, their wages had increased by 1/3, still very low, but there'd been a significant increase. We look a little bit at the wage-earning sectors, and Amina, you alluded to this earlier, wages for domestic workers in South Africa. There's been a minimum wage introduced for domestic workers. I'm sure Myrtle will have something to say about that later. And it sounds bizarre. It has no enforcement mechanism, and yet by some, there's been a normative shift, and wages have increased by 1/5. And interestingly, the chances of people having, the domestic workers having a formal contract has increased, but their levels of employment hasn't decreased. So it's worked. And again, if this has worked in one sector, maybe this is a model that can be extended to other sectors. Then we also look at some kind of universal protection. Some of the things that used to be associated with a formal job, they can be delinked from a job and actually be protections or benefits that are available to everyone. We look at the universal pension. I know it's something that Mauritius has had since 1958. We look at the example of Bolivia. The Renta Dignidad was introduced in 2008. By 2009, it was associated with a reduction in rural poverty of 6%. So we're seeing there's a range of policies that are effective, that are increasing productivity, they are increasing wages. And so the paper is a plea to governments and others to say, maybe this is where you need to focus your attentions, as well as looking at formalisation, structural adjustment, and some of the big, normative questions of sort of structural change that need to be delivered as well.
Brilliant. And I'm going to ask you just to do one thing in 1 minute, very quickly, which is quite a lot jumped out in what Amina said to me. But I'm quite curious. What was your sort of key takeaway from what you heard there?
I'm particularly interested in actually what you're talking about, the violence against workers. I mean, this is clearly, we're talking about domestic workers, this is clearly a sector where workers are very much open to abuse. It's behind closed doors, it's in people's households, other people's households. And I think anything that can help workers increase their agency, their sense that they have some kind of bargaining power in these kind of relationships with their employers, they're not a victim in this. I think that's incredibly important.
Myrtle, you have sort of both the experience of having worked in the conditions we're talking about, as well as then organised other women and I suppose men as well in these conditions. What sort of jumps out at you from the kind of policy prescriptions that you've just been hearing? What works and what doesn't work?
Well, I think that first of all, I would like to say thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your platform with the President. I think that when it comes to domestic work, I actually get very emotional and very carried away. The reason for that is because I've been a domestic worker and my life started, and today I'm sitting here because I challenged my employer to ask her, why am I different than you? I know I'm working for you. I know I'm in your house, but you don't treat me like a person. It's like an object that's in your house. And that is where I'm sitting here today. But what I would actually like to say is so much has changed for domestic workers. But the problem is this, what has changed for domestic workers are basically only on paper. And for us to make that papers become alive, for us to get that papers to work for us, it is a lot of challenging in our way. And I think what happened with our, organizing in South Africa, with the many labor laws we've got in South Africa, and that we do have some of the best labor laws in South Africa on paper. And then when we moved 2011 and when we won a victory in the ILO, I think that was a real history for domestic workers. For the first time, the ILO was shaken by the voices of domestic workers. For the first time, domestic workers could speak out for themselves. And we called that day, we've won our respect and our dignity. But what is it if we won our respect and our dignity and it's not being used at our workplaces? So today, we still challenge low minimum wages. We still challenge long hours. We still challenge migrant workers being exploited. We still challenge so many things that is not there for domestic workers. So why did we then form an international domestic workers network? We formed that because we want to show as women, when women come together and women unite, that we will take the world by force. And we did it. Today I'm sitting here 5 years later. We're going to have a Congress. We're going to look at what have we achieved? I'm sitting here today as a proud former domestic worker. Today we have 500,000 domestic workers in 65 countries and 65 organizations. But do we stop there? No. A lot of things we must put on paper. Like the Excellency is saying, why is it that domestic workers must always prove themselves? We are women, we are mothers, we are wives. Why is it that there's always question marks when anything comes up the table for domestic workers? In South Africa now, they're enforcing a national minimum wage. Again, sorry, domestic workers, you cannot get 100%. You're only getting 75%. Why? Yet when my employer and myself walk into that shop, we pay the same price. They're not saying, oh, are you the domestic worker? We're giving you a discount. So the question is, what have we done? There is so much I can say of domestic workers. But domestic workers on their own, we cannot move mountains. We need all of you. We need all of you to support our struggles. We need the presidents of the countries to stand up for us. We're moving to gender-based violence. Our Excellency has said it is there every day in the domestic sector, but it's a hidden subject. Because as soon as a domestic worker comes in, because she's staying on the premises of the employer, she gets scared because now she's going to lose that home. She's going to lose the little room and yet she's working to send money home to her family. So our challenges that we're facing, why are we still the informal workers? What is our work we're doing every day? Isn't that not formal that we're doing? Because we care for their homes. We are looking after their children. We are social workers. We are doctors. We are everything. Because they are working, building the economy. Yet they say we don't add to the building of the economy. But if we're not there in the houses of some of you also, how would you go out and build the economy? So the challenges for us now is, yes, how do we say that our work is formal work? How do we make it formal? 2 years ago, we adopted the slogan, domestic work is decent work. But it's still not decent work. It's still, you are a servant, you are a nanny, you are a maid, you are just a migrant worker. So the challenges there for us is, how do we make domestic work seen as work, like all other work? How do we make domestic workers seen as human beings? And how do we see the domestic workers as a decent work? And the slogan that we call ourselves, that we are proud of, our work make all work possible. Because without our work, there won't be any other work. Because in South Africa, I know domestic work is still slavery because our employees are so lazy in South Africa, they won't be able to do their own work because they don't even know where to start. But so what I would like to say to you here, I am proud that I've been a domestic worker. It has made me what I am. I am proud that today I can speak out for domestic workers because I know that pain of being isolated, but our challenges is going on. We need you. You know, I always say it's nice to listen to us. I always say it's nice to talk about us. But what are we doing for the domestic sector? How do we go back or ensure in our country that we go to the domestic workers organization and we ask the domestic workers, what can we do for you? It's not always about money. It's about a support. And for that, I want to leave you. How are you going to assist us? What are you going to do so that one day I can also say our work is formal work? I'm so proud of that. But the challenges we have to overcome, the little wages, the minimum wages, the system where they still take away our passports, where we are dehumanized because we are not people, that is still there. It's there every day. In many countries, when we go, you feel so hopeless because you don't know what to tell domestic workers. You don't know. You cannot give them freedom. It's only that country. So our challenge here remains to challenge countries, to talk to presidents. That's why I'm so glad we've got the president here, to talk to them. What can we do in your country? How can we better the life of domestic workers? And that's my question. What I want to say is help us so that our work is formal work and that we get decent pay for decent work. Thank you.
Myrtle, thank you. I'm going to leave you with a question that we're going to come back to when the floor opens. But I'm just really curious. We're talking a lot about sort of the laws, minimum wages, etc. And I'm just very curious to find out what happens. You pass a sort of well thought out law, or minimum wage, but what is happening in the kind of sort of privacy or secrecy of the household? So I'm going to come back to that. But in the meantime, I'd like to bring in Louise because then there we go, Louise. I'm sort of looking at the screen rather than you. I'm not sure where to look. your research has really covered some of the kind of more abstract questions around the difficulties in policymaking and what governments should be doing when addressing some of these issues. And I just wonder if you can give us a few of the key sort of issues in trying to get governments to grapple with these issues.
Sure. First of all, I want to say that I'm glad that ODI is really engaging so pragmatically in this space, in this policy space and research space. I read the paper. I liked the paper. The idea of pragmatism in this space, I think, is finally starting to reach people, policymakers, researchers, stakeholders in developing countries. I mean, you quote Marty Chen, and her work and the WIGO network has been arguing for this kind of pragmatism for decades. I myself, I think, have been arguing for it for about a decade. So I'm glad to see that this picture is coming on board, because indeed we know for a fact that the share of workers in informal work really only declines with two things: a slower growing labor force, and that goes back to demographics and fertility, and structural change, more capital, more technology, more management in the economy. And that takes time. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Now, so what would I advise policymakers? Well, the first thing I would say is that most policymakers don't actually know enough about this sector, because they don't collect data on it, because formal sector work is supposed to be the only work that's valuable. And so this prejudice against this kind of work shows up in international statistical standards, and, analysis of this work is really not using the right techniques. So I think that's the first point, is find out who your workforce is, where they're working, why they're working, where they're working, what are their working conditions, what makes them have low pay and low earnings, and what can you do about it? That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, and I'm really glad to hear about the domestic work speaker, to hear from her personal experience, because, I would say that, Myrtle, I don't know how many policymakers you've talked to, but probably not enough. Solutions to this problem can't be top down. They just can't. I would say policymakers need to engage, and all stakeholders, donors, policymakers, whomever, really need to build and support effective structures for collective action and collective voice. The top-down programs and top-down kind of regulations on the book don't really help. I'm sure, Myrtle, if you had more time, you would have some ideas about how South Africa could enforce its great laws better. You would have some ideas about how domestic workers can find out more about their rights. I think that's also true about other policies, such as social protection. I remember interviewing a bunch of market people, women and men, and other people, craftsmen in the informal sector, in Ghana shortly after they introduced their informal sector pension. And none of them really thought it was a good idea, would help them. And I thought to myself, wow, did the government in Accra and all those guys in suits actually interview these people and find out what they wanted, instead of just sort of offering a product that they may or may not want? So they were much happier about health insurance, for example, than social protection. So maybe we need to start there. Who knows? And then finally, I would stress the heterogeneity, which was also mentioned in the paper. I would say there are some categories, and we can lump people into categories and try to understand what works to improve the conditions of work, that is, the stability of earnings, and the amount of earnings and the quality of work. for different categories. And the situation of domestic workers is fundamentally different, of course, from women who are hairdressers in their home or market women. And so it's important to understand the differences. They're different issues. Finally, one point I think which is often left out, we think about, okay, I would say if you look at the majority of programs for this sector, they're all about training. Training. Everybody needs training. Okay, why don't we look at urban policy, for example? I remember having a discussion years ago with the mayor of Dar es Salaam, and I said, this is how many households are engaged in the informal sector work, either at home, in their own work, in their own home, or in markets, or just walking the street. And I said, in your new fancy Dar es Salaam, 2030 plan, did you plan for space for these people, space to work? Because your city's growing at 6%, and this sector is going to grow at 6% too. And you can't just have a few little here and there. So I really think we need to spend a lot more time on urban policy and secure access to workplace. That means a workplace where you can leave your stuff, where you have electricity, where you have water, where it's safe, where the police are part of the solution, not part of the problem. These are issues that we should also be, I think, taking up. I liked in the paper the discussion and the linkage between urban employment and informal employment and informal housing. And that again goes back to urbanization and urban policy and whether we're adequately considering or engaging this group. So I think I'll stop now, but that's sort of what's on my list right now.
Louise, thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. I'm coming back to you. A couple of references have already been made to for instance, the pension policy that your government has introduced. I'd like to just ask you how why did the government introduce that, and how illustrative is it, or how useful has it been in terms of trying to extend some of the social protection that you spoke about earlier into informal workers?
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the pension policy. I think recently we also introduced the minimum wage in Mauritius, right across the board, and even domestic workers also they will also, of course, be benefiting from the minimum wage. Now, just to go back again to the social protection. In Mauritius, we offer not just for the pension, we also have a social safety net for those who are vulnerable. We also offer, in terms of the social benefits, we also offer free education and free healthcare. And recently, free transport as well for for kids to go to school, and for the elderly as well. Now, this policy, and also very early on, immediately after independence, we adopted a fairly rigid family planning. But now this is going against us because now we have an aging population. But I think what the thinking fathers at the time had in mind is that if we want to change the dynamic, if we want to change the prosperity of the people in Mauritius, we need to have this basic social security net, and that includes education. Because education, we know, is the biggest enabler, it's a social enabler that the world knows. And I think we also a good example of how this has happened, because immediately after independence, the per capita was about $200, and now we are among the highest on the continent. Now, how did this happen? It didn't happen just by what we call increase in the Mauritian miracle. There is no miracle. It was a systematic, consistent policy that has been thought in order to bring this to bear in terms of the change. Now, how this has happened is that with an educated workforce, we managed to start a fledgling industrialization, which has then morphed into the industrial financial services and banking and computer science and IT in terms of a service. So all these have been thought of, and we have seen the transformative power of this social protection in our country. And this is, I think, a messaging that we can send out. But more importantly, we are an ethnically diverse population, and we have shown to the world that through education, through mutual dialogue, through interfaith, intercultural dialogue, we can become also a beacon to the world in terms of living together. So this is what I think is also very important in terms of the social stability of our country, that this is possible and doable.
I'm going to push you a little bit on this because we all know the old joke about politics and sausage making, and you don't want to look too closely. But clearly, there must have been a lot of sort of squeezing and grinding and whatever it is in trying to get these policies through. And I'm just quite keen to get a sense of what was some of the kind of political dynamic in trying to bring in social protections, minimum wages, and the like. How easy is it to generate a consensus?
Well, the ones that were taken, I think, was before I was born. But what I can experience is that I can tell you is in terms of education, because I'm a net beneficiary of this. Now, just like any innovative idea, it went through the cycle of it is stupid, it became dangerous, and now it's become obvious. So it went through the same process. So the same thing happened in 1975 when this decision was taken. It was enacted in 76, and people say, oh, God, this is not going to work because we're not prepared for it. It will make the country bankrupt. But again, I must stress on the fact that expenditure in education is not an expense, it's an investment. And we understood that from a very early age, that education, investment in social protection, in health, in education, they are not expensive. And this is something the narrative has to change because it's an investment that we make. And almost 30% of our GDP goes into this service.
And I know you've all got questions on the floor, so forgive me, but I'm going to push you 1 inch further, which is just politics is about trade-offs. What couldn't you do? What couldn't your country do in making those trade-offs that it did to prioritise, for instance, education?
Well, there was no trade-off at all. I mean, we thought that these were priorities and we had to do it. And we have not compromised on this. And as I said, maybe something that we need to rethink again is the policy for family control, for birth control. But now we have an aging population because Africa, we are increasingly saying, 18 to 20, we have an average 45. So we have to rethink this policy and see how now to benefit from contractual workers, because increasingly we are getting a lot of our sectors which is going with migrant workers. We are talking about migration. We get a lot of people from overseas coming in to man this. But again, this is a policy that we have to really look at because we need talent. We know that inbreeding is not healthy, so we need to have this new blood, new ideas, so that because the ambition of Mauritius now is to go into the knowledge economy, and knowledge economy, of course, brain power, and this has to be re-looked into that so that we create the appropriate opportunities, not just for expatriates, but also for our diaspora to come back. So we have the responsibility of creating the enabling environment to make it such that these people will want to come back and work there.
Brilliant. I'm going to open this to questions from the floor. We can take them in small groups, perhaps 2 or 3 at a time. If you would just be so kind as to tell us who you are and sort of what your affiliation is. So do I have any questions? Do I see any hands? I see a hand over there. Do we have a roving mic? So a woman over there.